Welcome back to Education Transformation, where we explore the shifts reshaping how we teach, learn, and grow. I'm your host, Alexandra McCare. Today's guest is someone whose work has deeply impacted how I think about learning, not just as a process, but as a relationship. Dr. Lori Desautels is a professor at Butler University and the creator of the Applied Educational Neuroscience framework. She's a leading voice in helping educators understand what's actually happening in the brain and body when students learn and when they struggle. In this conversation, we trace Dr. Lori's own journey from curiosity to creation to the incredible contributions she's now making through her own books, her program, and her presence in schools across the US. We talk about nervous system regulation, co-regulation, emotional safety, and how education can become not just more effective, but more human. This episode is for anyone who's ever sensed that connection comes before content, and that healing is just as important as instruction. Let's dive in. Hello, Dr. Desautels. Thank you so much for joining me on Education Transformation. I'm really excited for our audience to get to know more about you and your work. So thank you for joining me today.
Alexandra, thank you for having me. I'm excited to have the conversation.
Great, great. Well, let's start with you have spoken openly about the difference between education, re-education, and education reform. Could you talk a little bit about the distinction and why is it important?
So, from my perspective, I feel that education reform is more of a band aid. It's almost trying to fix or find an algorithm or, just not even a nuance, just something that is more on a superficial level that, we intentionally make a change. But when I think about reimagining education, it really is rooted in neuroscience. It's rooted in the adult nervous system, and it's rooted in being trauma responsive when we are applying and translating, exploring, and delving deep into our discipline data.
Hmm. Speaking of discipline data, let's segue into your description of behavior. You often say that behavior is a state.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how does that help us shift the way we view discipline?
So, behavior is a signal, it's an indicator that the nervous system is really struggling. And we are so conditioned, at least in the Western part of the world. And I'm generalizing, but we typically look at the surface, we look at a behavior, and then we begin to try to remediate or fix the behavior. But we're not looking at what's beneath the behavior. And so that we can think about that as an autonomic nervous system state. We can think about that as a state of consciousness, which is our autonomic nervous system state. Um, and so when we begin to peel those layers and to take a deeper dive into the nervous system, we are able to address what might feel threatening or scary or comfortable or connecting or available to our children, youth, and also to ourselves, because this work begins with delving into our own nervous systems first.
Absolutely. And your TED Talk speaks about that, and you encourage educators to heal themselves first. I completely agree. And I have incorporated a lot of practices in the AME model that help both the learner and the learning facilitator sort of reset before they begin. But for an educator maybe who's not even familiar with what we're talking about, resetting the nervous system and regulating emotions and being self-aware, somebody who is just for the first time getting a clue about this, what would you say to them?
The nervous system, when we talk about the nervous system, it is the brain and the body in constant communication. And so our nervous systems are always working to protect us because the brain's number one priority, therefore, the nervous system's number one priority is survival. So when we think about survival, some of us can recognize that term by thinking of fight, flight, or freeze. That's traditionally how we think of survival states. In those activated nervous system states, there is a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that is all about our ability to pause or to hold strong working memory or to make decisions or to process or to be or to predict or to be creative. And when we are in those survival states, this prefrontal cortex, and I'm simplifying and being very schematic, but it literally begins to go offline so that we are unable in states of chronic stress to use reason, to use logic, to pause. And that's what I'm referring to when I talk about what's beneath the behavior, is that we have to look at these autonomic nervous system states that we all move through fluidly and dynamically every day, all day. But it's when we get stuck in a survival state and when our children and youth feel, just really either shut down or they're running or they're fighting because their entire nervous system is trying to protect them. And when that is ongoing, that brings on so much duress. And then we see behaviors that we call oppositional or defiant or aggressive or violent or withdrawn or manipulative or disrespectful, because we are a society in this Western part of the world that really clings to labels and classifications, medically and educationally.
That is so true. And I know you have worked with some of your students and colleagues now, and you've created the Body and Brain Brilliance Manual as sort of like a toolkit for those of us who are working with youth to utilize in our classrooms. It's full of tons of wonderful micro practices. But again, if we're talking to an audience now that maybe is unfamiliar with what the practices entail, and how would you suggest someone start to incorporate that into their classroom routine?
Well, I think that, in fact, I brought a couple of notes I wanted to share, knowing that we would be talking about the nervous system. But
Great.
I think where I would begin is we need to begin with ourselves. So awareness, and that's a key word here, awareness. And I want to define that today because sometimes it feels very trendy, it feels trite. Self-awareness is about our imagination, our attention, and our focus. So we are always using our imaginations. And most of you will think, well, not really, but we do in very negative ways. When we worry, we are imagining a negative outcome. When we are anxious, we are moving into something that may not have happened yet, but the brain and the body feel it to be familiar. So when we talk about self-awareness, it's really about combining the power of focus, because focus is the architect of our reality. And this is something that when you're focused, then your attention is there. It becomes familiar to the brain. And then when we go out into the world and there is something that the brain sees that feels familiar to what you've been focusing on, it kind of takes a deep breath and it says, this is familiar. I don't have to move into survival. So let me give an example of that. When I'm working with my students, we talk about doing focused attention practices before a test. And so when you can begin to take some deep breaths and you can begin to really focus in on, maybe a sound or a taste or a smell that feels, that eases your nervous system, your body actually kind of moves into what we know as social engagement or rest and digest. And when you're taking the test, you actually have created, by focus and attention, access to this prefrontal cortex so that you can begin to test well. And there's so much research, and so really it's about knowing that our superpower is our awareness. Our superpower is our ability to focus. Our superpower is our imagination, because the brain cannot tell the difference between something that we imagine and something that is in our external world that's real. And so when we begin to imagine and visualize holding a lemon, I'm just going to give you an example. And
Sure.
we cut it in half, and you bring half of that lemon up to your nose. You smell it, you taste it with your tongue, you squeeze the juice into your mouth. You can feel the pulp and the seeds in your mouth. And all of a sudden, as you visualize and imagine having to swallow all of that lemon juice, you have extra saliva in your mouth, which I do right now. So I'm not holding a lemon, and that is something that's an example that we use with our students.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
The
I
mind,
really, really do have extra saliva in my mouth right now.
I really do too.
Yeah.
The mind is it's so powerful, and what you're saying right now is just lighting me up inside. Because just as a quick side note before we segue to the next segment, as you know, I was recently accepted into your Applied Educational Neuroscience graduate program at Butler University. And I'm so thrilled because it really feels like a full circle moment for me, because what we're talking about now and everything that you have championed, I've woven into the always meaningful education model. And I'm just so excited to root it in the modern neuroscience.
Mhm.
And really what you're talking to about this focus and attention, it resonates with me because I really believe in starting the learning journey with curiosity. Because I have learned that when we are curious, we have the dopamine is released in our brain, and we have desire dopamine and control dopamine. And the desire dopamine is wanting us to reach for something beyond us, and then the control dopamine is actually helping us plan how to get there. So it's like what we're talking about here is removing the barriers from from kids learning experiences, making it easy for focus and attention and motivation to accompany them as they're learning. So I'm just really excited to be a part of the program.
Thank you, Alexandra. And to your point, um, when our children and adolescents learn about their nervous systems, they feel so relieved. They
Yes.
feel empowered. They begin to take autonomy, and they can begin to embrace some agency in their day-to-day life. I have seen it hundreds of times. And that's the most exciting part, is that as a mom, as a teacher, as a professor, I am joining up with my students and my children to learn together. You don't have to be like an expert in neuroscience. In fact, our kids, that's why we wrote the manual, Body and Brain Brilliance, because the very first chapter is all about adults. So if I'm a parent, a caregiver, a teacher, it's introduced to you, and it shares, practices for us as adults to begin to embody, so that we can experience the impact of learning about our nervous systems in the way our children and youth will as well. So the manual has simple practices, for adults first, and then for adolescents, and then for our children.
Wonderful. What a fantastic resource for people.
Mhm.
I'd like to just take you now into the always meaningful education framework, because I personally am very curious, and I want to know, what was your curiosity? What was the curiosity that led you on this path to develop the program of applied educational neuroscience, and your TED Talk, and helping schools across the country really understand about their nervous system regulation and how to incorporate those practices to remove barriers and help everyone have a healthier, more positive experience? But what was it initially? What drew you to this?
I think as a former special education teacher, I taught children with the classification of emotional disturbance. And this was in the early 90s. And it felt, that label felt very just harmful, is really the best word I can think of. And I began to really study and explore, like, what happened maybe before I'm seeing a disruption or an infraction. I thought about environments that my students were exposed to. I thought about relationships that were present or weren't. I don't know, I became very curious as a young teacher, knowing that it's not a fix or formula, and also what I began to notice, and I noticed this as a young mom too, is that, especially with our oldest son, Andrew, is that punitive discipline practices actually can create more harm than good. And it makes the situation worse. And I saw that in our oldest son. It didn't, the consequences he feared, but they didn't change his behavior. And like when I say feared, I mean, he didn't want to be grounded. And
Right.
grounding him wasn't working. Raising my voice wasn't working. It was actually activating both of us more. And it's true for me as a teacher as well, timing kids out. Um, you know, we say, I love what Gabor Mate says. He says, when kids need us the most, we send them away. And as
Mm.
parents and caregivers and teachers, that's how that's how we were taught, or maybe that's how we were parented. But we know now that children and adolescents that are, and I want to be careful with this too. When I say experiencing adversity and trauma, that is every human being. So the practices through our framework at Butler University and through Applied Educational Neuroscience are what we call tier one practices. So they're for all of us. And I also want to say that when I talk about Black and Brown and special education students being over identified in our discipline systems and disproportionately punished, I want to be very careful there too, because it's not that these groups of children or adolescents bring in more trauma, it's that the way that our schools read the behavior can be very harmful to those children and adolescents. I hope that was clear.
Yes, it makes perfect sense to me. I completely can understand that perspective, and it resonates with me as true also.
Mm.
So, in the AIM framework, we go from this curiosity and we go through a creation stage. First, it creates change within us, and then we create change outside of ourselves. And in the framework, we like our learning journeys to culminate in some kind of contribution. So I can hear already you're talking about the changes that were happening within you. When did you start to shift to changing things outside of yourself and leading towards your contributions?
I think that began after um, when I began teaching in higher ed, and because after I left my teaching career, I went into school counseling, and then my curiosity and evolution continued looking at behaviors. And then I became a mom, which that continued on. And I was home for just a few years with them, and then went back part time. But when I went into higher education for the first time after my doctoral work, I was introduced to Dr. Judy Willis, and she is a neurologist out of Santa Barbara, a neurosurgeon. And she left her medical practice and became a middle school teacher
Wow.
after several years, because she was so frustrated with the ways that we were teaching our children and adolescents. And so she came to Marian University when I began there in 2009, 2010. And we became friends and colleagues, and she's been my mentor ever since. And so I think that was, when you ask about external contributions, I began to then teach about that. At that point, I was teaching about just the brain, not the nervous system, because we didn't know as much about the entire nervous system. And I began to teach this to my graduate students, and also to my undergrad students. And to be very honest, on this podcast, it was seen as heresy at the beginning of this, because that was the time in education. 2000, early 2000s was zero tolerance policy in our schools. And so it really did not align with the traditional punitive practices that were being put into place. And so I struggled because charter schools and public schools were kind of shifting into this not only zero tolerance, but a very punitive expulsion and suspension mindset for small infractions, insignificant infractions. And I rubbed up against that. And it was really a difficult time in my career.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I do recall back in the early 2000s, and we were also still dealing with the No Child Left Behind as well, the zero tolerance. And those things did not support the development of our children.
No, and
Yeah.
we know now,
Yes, we know
and now,
now.
yes, and it's just yeah, it's science. And I also went back into the classroom 10 years ago while I was teaching in higher ed, and I'm still in the classroom. And so I think I'm in there 2 days a week, and I wanted to co-teach and to integrate these practices from body and brain brilliance and all of the practices over the last 12 years myself. I wanted to be on the ground level, and I wanted to see for myself how warming up the nervous system, using bell work, using exits, and using procedures can make a difference. And it's been remarkable. I mean, we're collecting data every year.
That's incredible. So let's talk about your contributions now. They are many, but which one would you say you are most proud of right now?
I think I really do feel it's being back in the classroom. I mean, there are a lot
Mm.
of authors, a lot of people write books. I mean, a lot of people do TED Talks, a lot of people make videos. I feel like when I am asked to present to an organization, community, district, I think the big game changer when I walk in is that I'm not just sharing theoretical or abstract um, research. I mean, it's what I'm doing every week,
Yes, your
and that
practice.
it's been hard. I mean, it's been really hard to keep that consistent, predictable schedule and being in a classroom 2 afternoons or 2 mornings a week with my own schedule. But I think that's what I'm most proud of.
I could totally understand that. That's the real you're practicing what you're preaching, as they sometimes say, right? So then could you talk to me a little bit about where do you start? You know, maybe there's a new teacher or somebody who's going to start at the end of this summer, first time in the classroom. Where do you start when you go into a new classroom and you're getting ready to introduce body and brain brilliance practices? Where do you begin?
Well, all of these practices that we've been talking about are about connection. And we know that attachment is the carrier of development. So, as a new teacher, I would just be so intentional about cultivating relationships because they are not warm, fuzzy extras. Relationships drive cognition, they help develop the entire body and brain, and they are critical for learning. And many of our children and adolescents throughout the world and throughout our country are walking into our schools for connection and for safety. And if they aren't experiencing that, then they cannot learn because of brain development. So to learn, to learn well, to be able to process any type of academic learning, we have to feel safe in our environments and we have to feel felt. And
Yes.
that's what I would share with a new teacher.
Oh, thank you so much. Really, I was just getting goosebumpy as you were saying that. It's near and dear to me as well. And it's always advice that I give. Just establish a relationship. Let them know that you care. It changes the dynamics of the classroom, the culture of the classroom. So if neuroscience is the compass and connection is the path, where do you hope this movement will take us, let's say in the next decade?
Well, I feel that in the next 10 years, because my two daughters asked me that, they just said, Mom, what do you wish for? And not just in education, but in our just in our mental health practices with children and adolescents and families, really. And I think that the path would look like really diving not only beneath behaviors, but using breath and movement and our sensory systems to begin to, and using those routinely and predictably and consistently, um, to begin to know that our 4 and 5 and 6 year olds, when they know that they're feeling rough, as we say in our house, they know what to reach for. And they understand the power of intentional breath work and movement. And it's so much more than mindfulness. I don't even like that term because
Mm.
it's not taken seriously. And that's what I love about applied educational neuroscience, because it's really the neuroeducation of the nervous system. It's much more than, just telling someone to breathe or, I don't know. It is. We've been very intentional about how we're rolling out these what we call focused attention practices that prepare and warm up and prime the nervous system to move through the day with less distress and more ease.
Yes. Mm. Okay, I have a few just closing questions, a little bit of brain picking here. What would you say gives you the most hope about where education is heading right now?
I think the emails and the messages and just all of the educators, social workers, counselors, parents, caregivers that reach out to me and just say thank you, or they will send images, of the work they're doing in schools or in their community centers. So, the brain has a negative bias, and we all pay attention to negative news, negative trends, but there's so much more that's happening that is for the good of all. And I'm grateful for those people that reach out and share.
Awesome. So, if you could whisper one thing into the ear of every school leader around the world, what would it be?
I think it would be the greatest intervention you can give to your children and to your students is to do your own work.
Mm, we have to take care of ourselves first if we're going to show up for anyone else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. Dr. Lori, you are clearly an incredible resource. How can people find you, find your work, your materials?
Well, thank you, Alexandra. So it is revelationsineducation.com. And on that website, you will find literally everything and 90% of it is free and downloadable. And yeah, please stay in touch and reach out.
Awesome. And I'd like to just add that you are also active voice on LinkedIn, and your posts are always insightful and inspiring. So people can also see you there.
LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Social,
Oh,
X
wow.
for a while. And yeah, please
Wow,
reach out.
you're on everything. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Lori, do you have any closing words for our audience?
No, thank you so much for having me, Alexandra. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lori. Take care.
Thank you.